Hello, my name is Zayden Blackwood. I'm 28 years old, living in New Orleans, Louisiana, a city bursting with color where the streets are filled with the scent of magnolia blossoms and the faint sound of saxophones drifting from bar rooms. I'm a high school history teacher, a job I love with every fiber of my being. Every day, standing in front of my classroom, I tell the kids about wars, civilizations, and the people who shaped history. I love watching their eyes light up when they realize the past isn't just dry dates and events, but vivid stories full of blood, sweat, and tears. But in my family's eyes, my job is worthless. A petty profession. My father once said, his voice cold as stone, unworthy of the Blackwood name. My family, how do I describe them? They're like a book with a beautiful cover, but open it up and the pages inside are torn and tattered. My father, Theodore Blackwood, is the CEO of a mining and timber empire founded by my grandfather. He's ambitious, sharp, and sometimes ruthless. To him, everything revolves around power and money. He sees me as a failure, a son who refuses to follow the path he's laid out. Zayden, you have a brain, but you choose to live like a nobody, he often says, his eyes cutting through me like a blade. I never respond. Not because I'm afraid, but because I know arguing with him is pointless, like pouring water into desert sand. Then there's Hunter, my younger brother, 3 years my junior, but 10 times more arrogant. Hunter works in the family company, propped up and pampered by our father. He lives in expensive suits, drives a sleek sports car, and never misses a chance to brag about his bonuses from big deals. To him, I'm a joke. Big brother, why don't you ditch that chalkboard job and do something real? He once said, his lip curling in a mocking sneer. I just gave a faint smile. Hunter doesn't understand, and probably never will, that I don't live for money. I live for those moments when a shy student raises their hand to ask about Napoleon, or when I see them passionately debating the meaning of freedom. The only person in my family who truly understood me, who truly saw me, was my grandfather, William Blackwood. He was a legend, not just in our family, but in the business world. From nothing, he built a billion-dollar mining and timber empire. A former soldier from humble beginnings, he grew up in a ramshackle house on the outskirts where every meal was a struggle. Once he told me about his childhood, walking 5 miles in the rain to collect firewood to sell, just so his mother could afford bread. Nothing is impossible, Zayden, he said, his voice deep and resolute, as long as you don't give up. My grandfather was tough on most people. He never hesitated to fire a lazy employee or go toe-to-toe with a major business partner. But with me, he was different. He looked at me with warm eyes, as if he saw something in me that others didn't. Maybe it was sincerity, maybe it was patience, or maybe he saw a piece of his younger self, a boy who refused to bow to hardship even when the world turned its back. I remember the late afternoons when I was a kid, when he'd take me to the banks of the Mississippi River. We'd sit on an old wooden bench watching the water flow lazily by. He'd tell me about his days as a soldier, about the years of war, about surviving long nights in jungles where death lurked behind every tree. You know, he once said, his eyes glinting with a deep sadness, war taught me that surviving isn't about luck. It's about choosing to stand up, even when you have nothing left but yourself. But he also always wanted me to take over the family business. Zayden, you've got what it takes, he said, his voice full of hope. You're smart, you're persistent. You could lead this company, protect what I've built. I knew he didn't say it for the money. To him, the company wasn't just a business, it was his legacy, his life's blood. But I couldn't follow his wishes. I'd seen too much of the family's business world. Tense meetings, fake handshakes, underhanded tactics to crush competitors. I saw my father grow distant from my mother, saw Hunter become increasingly vain. To me, the business world was a battlefield without humanity. I didn't want to be part of it. The first time I told my grandfather I wanted to be a teacher, I braced for a storm. but instead he fell silent, looking at me for a long time. His eyes held a flicker of regret, but not anger. "Are you sure, Zayden?" he asked, his voice low like still lake water. I nodded, my heart pounding. "I want to live a life that matters, Grandpa. I want to do something truly important, not just for money." He didn't say anything more. He just patted my shoulder, a heavy but warm gesture. From then on, he never pressured me to change my mind. He respected me, though I knew deep down he still hoped I'd one day reconsider. In the years that followed, my bond with my grandfather grew stronger. During family gatherings, while my father and Hunter were busy boasting about new deals, he and I would slip outside, sit on the porch, sip coffee, and talk about everything under the sun. He told me about the mistakes he'd made, the times he nearly lost everything. "Life isn't always fair, Zayden," he said, "but if you live true to your heart, you'll have no regrets." I listened, and I held his words close. But things weren't always smooth. My father grew increasingly harsh. He didn't just belittle my job, he belittled who I was. "You're a disgrace to the Blackwood name," he once shouted in my face during a family party when I refused a position in the company. Hunter, of course, didn't miss the chance to pile on. "Keep dreaming with your history books, big brother," he sneered, "but don't expect a share of Grandpa's fortune." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I knew my grandfather understood me, and that was enough. In those years, I lived my own life. I loved teaching, loved the early mornings when I walked into class with a hot coffee, loved the after-school chats with students. But deep down, there was always a void. Maybe it was the feeling of not belonging to my family. Maybe it was the fear that I'd disappointed my grandfather, even if he never said so. I often wondered, was I on the right path? Was I living up to what he expected of me? That question lingered in my mind, like a faint cloud that wouldn't dissipate. Until one October afternoon when everything came crashing down. I had just finished teaching a class about the American Revolution, gathering my books when my phone rang. It was my mother, her voice trembling as if she were holding back a storm. "Zayden, your grandfather, he's gone." I stood frozen, still clutching my lesson plan, as the world around me blurred. A sudden stroke, she said, had taken him from us while he was sitting in his office, the place where he'd spent his life building the Blackwood Empire. I didn't cry right then. I only felt a cold void spreading through my chest, as if a piece of my heart had been carved out. I rushed home, driving through the familiar streets of New Orleans. The sound of saxophones drifted from bars along Charles Avenue, but today they weren't soulful. The scent of magnolia blossoms wafted by, but it no longer felt fragrant. All I could think about was my grandfather. My only true anchor in this family, the one person who didn't see me as a failure. And now he was gone, leaving me in a world that seemed to have no place for me. My grandfather's funeral took place a few days later in an old church in the French Quarter. The entire extended family gathered, familiar faces that felt strangely distant. My father, Theodore, stood in the front row, his black suit impeccable, his expression solemn but his eyes betraying a hint of calculation. My brother Hunter stood beside him, his hair neatly slicked back, his phone buzzing incessantly with work messages. Other relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, whispered among themselves, their glances darting with suspicion. The atmosphere was mournful, but beneath it ran undercurrents of ambition. I stood in a corner, silently watching my grandfather's oak coffin, my heart heavy. I didn't care about wealth or wills. I just wanted him to hear me, to let me tell him one more time that I loved him, that I was grateful for his unwavering belief in me. But I knew with this family a funeral wasn't just a place for grief. It was the prelude to a silent war. My father and Hunter didn't hide their confidence. "The company is ours," I overheard my father say to an uncle, his voice resolute. "Dad left me and Hunter in charge of everything. The biggest assets are surely ours." Hunter smirked, glancing at me. "Zayden's probably getting a few of Grandpa's old books," he said loudly enough for me to hear. I looked toward my grandfather's resting place, my eyes drifting to some distant point. If he left me anything, it wouldn't just be money or property. It would be a lesson, as he always taught me. The day of the will's reading came sooner than I expected. It was a gray morning with New Orleans shrouded in clouds, as if the city itself were in mourning. We were summoned to my grandfather's lawyer's office, an old building in the heart of the city, with oak-paneled walls and stained glass windows dulled by time. The meeting room was spacious, the air heavy, as if the space itself were holding its breath. My family sat around a long table, eyes fixed on the elderly lawyer who had worked for my grandfather for decades. My father sat at the head, tapping his fingers on the polished wood, his face calm but brimming with confidence. Hunter sat beside him, legs crossed, phone in front of him as if ready to take notes on every detail. I sat at the far end quiet, wanting nothing more than for this to be over so I could return to my life. The lawyer, with his snow-white hair and steady, deep voice, began reading the will. My grandfather's estate was divided clearly. The majority of the company's shares went to my father and Hunter, along with properties in Louisiana and Texas. Other relatives received sums of money, stocks, or smaller assets. Everyone nodded, murmured, satisfied with their portions. I didn't expect much, maybe a small sum to support my teaching without financial strain. But when the lawyer called my name, the room's atmosphere grew tense. All eyes turned to me as if I were an outsider who had just walked in. "Zayden Blackwood," the lawyer read, his voice deliberate. "Mr. William Blackwood leaves you 10% of the company's shares and $10 million in a bank account. However, this inheritance comes with a special condition." I looked up, my heart racing. "A condition?" My father frowned and Hunter smirked. The lawyer continued, his words measured but striking like hammer blows. "Zayden must live for 30 consecutive days in the old Blackwood family cabin in the mountains on the outskirts of New Orleans. He must enter with only minimal clothing and supplies, no money, no phone, and no contact with the outside world. Each week, Theodore and Hunter will visit to confirm he is complying with the rules. If Zayden fails or gives up, his entire inheritance will be divided equally between Theodore and Hunter Blackwood." Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence. Then Hunter burst into laughter, his cold, sharp laugh echoing through the room. "What a joke," he said, turning to my father. "After coddling him all these years, Grandpa finally wants him to face reality." My father didn't laugh, but his eyes gleamed with triumph. "Zayden, you should refuse now," he said, his voice icy. "Don't embarrass the family any further." The other relatives whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others looking at me with pity. To them, this condition was nothing short of humiliation, a game my grandfather had devised to prove I wasn't worthy. But I didn't feel humiliated. I saw my grandfather. I saw his eyes, heard his voice, the words he spoke to me by the river. He never did anything without purpose. If he set this challenge, there was a reason. I looked at the lawyer and took a deep breath. "I accept," I said, my voice clear despite my pounding heart. Hunter stopped laughing, staring at me as if I'd lost my mind. My father's brow furrowed, but he said nothing. The lawyer nodded, handing me a document. I signed it, my hand trembling slightly, but a small fire of determination ignited within me. I left the office and stepped into the open air. Rain began to fall, cold droplets stinging my face. Behind me, I heard Hunter whispering to my father, his voice dripping with mockery. "He'll give up in 3 days." I didn't look back. I just kept walking under the gray sky, feeling as though the entire world was challenging me. The journey to the cabin began the very next day. I drove my old pickup truck, a gift from my grandfather when I graduated college. The road to the mountains was rugged, filled with gravel and mud, as if nature itself were testing me. My father and Hunter followed behind in a sleek black SUV like two vultures circling their prey. I knew they weren't there to see me off. They were there to monitor, to ensure I didn't cheat, and perhaps to wait for the moment I failed. A light drizzle hung in the air and fog wrapped around the towering trees, making the forest ahead look like a somber painting. The higher the road climbed, the narrower it became, flanked by dense pine forests, the wind whistling through them like eerie whispers. A chill ran down my spine, not just from the weather, but from the realization that I was about to face something bigger than myself. The Blackwood family cabin, a generational legacy, wasn't just a shelter. It was a challenge, a message from my grandfather, and I had to prove I was worthy. Finally, after more than 2 hours of driving, I saw it. The cabin emerged in a clearing amidst the sparse forest, a solitary shadow in the fog. It was smaller than I'd imagined, its shingled roof faded and leaking in places. The windows were broken, their panes streaked with dirt, spiderwebs draped across them like tattered curtains. The rusted chimney leaned precariously as if ready to collapse. The entire cabin exuded desolation, as if time had long forgotten it. I stopped the truck, my heart pounding. This was where I'd live for the next 30 days. No electricity, no running water, no contact with the outside world. Just me, the cabin, and my memories of my grandfather. Hunter stepped out of the SUV carrying a small suitcase with surveillance equipment. He set up cameras on the porch, his movements swift and precise, like someone laying a trap. "Keep warm tonight, big brother," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Don't cry for Grandpa too much." I didn't respond, just watched silently as he checked the devices, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. My father stood by the SUV, arms crossed, looking at me like a man staring at a doomed opponent. "Give up early and save yourself the trouble," he said coldly. "You're just a lowly teacher after all. What do you need all that money for?" I clenched my jaw, suppressing the anger rising within me. They didn't understand. They never would. To them, this challenge was a joke, a way for my grandfather to teach me a lesson about life's harsh realities. But I knew if he wanted me here, there was something I needed to find, not just in this cabin, but within myself. The doors of my father's and Hunter's SUV slammed shut, the sound echoing through the silent forest. Their tires rolled away, leaving muddy tracks on the road. I stood alone before the cabin, rain soaking through my jacket. In the small backpack on my shoulder, I carried only a few changes of clothes, a folding knife, and a lighter, the bare essentials allowed by the will. I looked at the cabin, a mix of fear and determination swirling in my chest. "If you believed I could do this, I won't let you down," I whispered, as if my grandfather were standing somewhere in the fog watching me. I pushed open the wooden door, its hinges screeching like a groan. Inside, the air hit me with a musty stench, a mix of rotting wood and damp earth. Faint light from the broken windows filtered in, revealing a cluttered room. Dust-covered furniture, a rusted fireplace in the corner, and creaking floorboards under every step. I set my backpack down and took a deep breath. This was my home for the next 30 days. This was my battlefield. The first night was a nightmare. I tried to start a fire in the rusted fireplace, but the chimney was clogged, sending smoke billowing back and making me cough violently, my eyes stinging. I dragged the pile of old firewood outside, picking out the driest pieces, and used my folding knife to pry up some floorboards for kindling. After hours of struggle, I managed to coax a small, flickering flame, like a candle on the verge of going out. I huddled by the fireplace, wrapped tightly in my jacket, but the cold still seeped through every layer, biting into my skin. Outside, the forest rustled, the hum of insects mingling with the howling wind, as if the woods were whispering threats. Every strange sound made my heart pound, as if some creature was lurking just beyond the door. I couldn't sleep, not just because of the cold, but because fear was gnawing at my mind. I questioned what I was doing here. Me, a history teacher accustomed to warm classrooms and the scent of book pages, now sitting in a derelict cabin with no food, no clean water, no one by my side. The camera on the porch blinked its red light like a soulless eye, reminding me that my father and Hunter were waiting for me to fail. Their mocking words echoed in my head. "A lowly teacher. He'll give up in 3 days." I clutched my head, trying to banish those thoughts, but they clung like the spider webs draped across the cabin's corners. On the second day, I started figuring out how to survive. I explored the forest around the cabin, hoping to find something edible. I spotted a few bushes with tiny, deep red berries, but I didn't dare try them. I remembered my grandfather once telling me about his days in the jungles of Vietnam, eating roots and leaves to survive. "You have to be careful," he'd said, his voice low but firm. "Nature isn't always generous." I pocketed a few berries, deciding to examine them more closely before eating. Water was a bigger problem. I found a stream about a 10-minute walk from the cabin, but the water was icy and tasted metallic like rust. I drank a few sips, forcing myself to swallow, but my stomach churned in protest. I tried hunting, but it was a miserable failure. I'm no hunter. The folding knife in my hand felt like a toy against the vast forest. Once I saw a rabbit dart by, but when I threw a rock, it vanished into the brush before I could blink. Hunger began to creep in, not just in my stomach, but in my mind. By the end of the second day, I was exhausted, dizzy, my head spinning. I slumped onto the floor, my back against the damp, moldy wall, feeling like the weight of the world was on my shoulders. "I won't last 30 days, I muttered, my voice hoarse. The thought of giving up flickered through my mind, subtle but dangerous, like a snake slithering through my thoughts. The third night was even worse. The bone-chilling cold seeped in, and the small fire in the fireplace wasn't enough to warm the room. I lay on a thin blanket, eyes wide open, staring at the cracked ceiling. The wind outside sang a haunting lullaby, pulling me into dark thoughts. I remembered my father's cold gaze as he said, "Give up early and save yourself the trouble." I remembered Hunter's smirk as he set up the surveillance cameras. And then, I remembered my grandfather. I remembered his eyes, stern yet full of trust, as if he knew I could do what I doubted myself. "If he believes in me, I have to believe in me," I whispered, clinging to the last scraps of resolve. On the morning of the fourth day, I decided to clean the cabin. Not just to make it less miserable, but to keep my mind occupied, to fend off the hunger and thirst closing in around me. While clearing a corner of the room, I found an old wooden chest covered in dust, its lock rusted. Curiosity piqued, I pried it open with my knife, my heart racing. Inside, among faded cloth, was an old leather-bound notebook. On the cover, in faint handwritten script, were the words, "Diary 1968. My hands trembled as I recognized my grandfather's handwriting. This was his story from his youth at 20 when he fought in the Vietnam War. I sat on the floor by the fireplace, opening the diary with the feeling of touching a piece of his soul. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but every word was sharp, as if he'd written them yesterday. He wrote about marching through jungles, the gnawing hunger, the constant fear of death lurking nearby. "Some nights I thought I'd never see the sun again," he wrote. "Comrades fell, their blood soaking the earth. But I kept going, not because I was strong, but because I knew my family was waiting for me to come home." I read, tears welling up. I saw him, a young man not so different from me, facing challenges 100 times harsher than mine. Then I came to a line written in bold, as if meant to be etched into the reader's mind. "Survival isn't about strength, but about the resolve not to give up." Those words hit me like a blow to the chest. I looked up, scanning the dilapidated cabin, feeling as if my grandfather were here, speaking directly to me. If he could survive a war, death, and despair, then I could survive 30 days in this cabin. The diary ended with a note. "The second volume is in the western corner of the attic. Only open it on day 15. My heart raced. My grandfather had planned this all along. This wasn't just a challenge. It was a journey he wanted me to undertake. I stood, wiping my tears, a surge of resolve rising in my chest. I began to plan. Clean the cabin thoroughly, explore the forest, find cleaner water, and learn to survive. The camera on the porch still blinked, but I was no longer afraid of it. In the days that followed, I began turning the cabin into a place I could live in. I learned to endure, to count every hour, every minute, to keep my mind from slipping into despair. Each night I sat by the fireplace where the flames now burned more steadily after I managed to clear the chimney. I reread the pages of my grandfather's first diary, his words about war and survival serving as a reminder that I wasn't alone. I started jotting down my own days on scraps of paper I found in the cabin. Not a diary, just scribbled notes. Day 6, found cleaner stream water. Day 7, fixed a window, less draft. Those lines made me feel like I was making progress, however small. The 15th day arrived, bringing with it a strange sense of anticipation. I woke early as the first rays of dawn pierced through the fog. The first diary had been clear. The second volume is in the western corner of the attic. I hadn't ventured to the attic before, as the wooden staircase leading up looked ready to collapse at any moment. But today I didn't hesitate. I grabbed a long stick from the firewood pile, testing each step before putting my weight on it. The stairs creaked and groaned under me, but I climbed, my heart pounding like a drum. The attic was small, stifling, filled with dust and the smell of rotting wood. Light from a broken window filtered in, illuminating old chests, tattered blankets, and a dust-covered armchair. I made my way to the western corner where broken planks were piled high. I carefully removed each one, dust swirling around me, making me cough. Then I saw it. A second leather-bound notebook wrapped in faded cloth, identical to the first. My hands trembled as I picked it up, as if I were holding a piece of my grandfather's soul. I carried it down to the main room, sat by the fireplace, and took a deep breath before opening it. The first page read, Diary, 1970, the days after the war. I read, and each line pulled me into a different world, my grandfather's world at 22, fresh from the Vietnam War. He wrote about the struggle to reintegrate into everyday life. The war took a piece of my soul, he wrote, but life afterward was even harsher. No one understood me. No one wanted to hire a young veteran with eyes always looking back. I felt the pain in every word. The loneliness of a young man trying to find his place in a world that had no room for his battle scars. He described starting from nothing. He took on every job, hauling cargo, fixing cars, even selling firewood to survive. He once borrowed a large sum to open a small lumber workshop, but it failed from the start. Customers didn't come, debts piled up, he wrote. Some nights I lay on the floor staring at the ceiling, thinking I'd never get back up. But he didn't give up. He found ways to learn, to start over, building the Blackwood empire I know today, step by step. A bolded line stopped me cold. Failure isn't the end. It's just a lesson if you dare to stand up and learn. I paused, my eyes welling with tears. Those words felt written for me for this very moment. I thought of myself, a teacher scorned by my family, called a failure by my father, mocked as a lowly teacher by Hunter. But my grandfather, who rose from the ashes of war and failure, believed I could do the same. I looked around the cabin. The roof still leaked. The windows were still broken, but it was cleaner, warmer, thanks to my efforts. I realized that fixing the cabin wasn't just about survival. It was a metaphor for rebuilding myself day by day, step by small step. From that day on, I worked with renewed energy. The cabin, once a desolate, threatening place, began to take on the semblance of a home, however rough. Each day I recorded what I did, a way to remind myself I was making progress, that I was making this challenge a part of me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living the way my grandfather had lived through his hardest days. What truly kept me going were the words in my grandfather's diaries. The second volume, with its stories of post-war struggles, failure, and perseverance, had ignited a fire within me. I no longer saw myself as the outcast scorned by my family. I saw myself as a man finding his way, just as my grandfather had. And I knew that day 20 would bring another piece of his story. The third diary, left as part of this challenge. On the morning of the 20th day, I woke with a mix of excitement and apprehension. The second diary had stated clearly, "The third volume is under the 5th floorboard from the large window in the eastern corner of the main room." I knelt on the floor, my hands trembling as I used my folding knife to pry up the board. The wood creaked, dust swirled, but there it was. Another leather-bound notebook carefully wrapped in faded linen, just like the first two. I carried it to the fireplace, sat down, and took a deep breath before opening it. The first page read, "Diary, 1980. The journey of building an empire." I turned the pages and my grandfather's world came alive before my eyes. He wrote about the early years of building his mining and timber company from a small workshop to a billion-dollar conglomerate. But behind that success were cold, ruthless decisions. He described firing old friends who couldn't keep up with his vision, battling competitors at any cost, even using tactics he wasn't proud of. "The business world is a battlefield," he wrote, "and sometimes to protect what you've built, you must do things that make your heart ache." But what stopped me in my tracks was the deep pain woven into those words. He wrote about the cost of his success, the growing distance from his family, especially from my father, Theodore, when he was young. "I was too busy with the company, with contracts and trips," he wrote. "I didn't realize I was missing the important years of Theodore's life." When I looked back, my son had become a stranger, full of ambition but lacking love. My heart tightened as I read. I thought of my father, his cold gaze. It turned out he wasn't just distant from me, but from his own father as well. My grandfather wasn't perfect. I had once thought of him as a hero, an invincible man, but these pages revealed a different William Blackwood, one full of contradictions and wounds. He had built an empire, but at the cost of a fractured family. And I realized this challenge wasn't just about proving myself. It was my grandfather's way of helping me understand him, his mistakes, and perhaps urging me to do better. I closed the diary, clutching it to my chest, tears silently falling. I wasn't crying out of sadness, but from a strange sense of closeness to my grandfather. He hadn't just left me a challenge. He'd left me his life, with its lessons, scars, and hopes. I looked around the cabin, seeing it as a metaphor for myself, imperfect, full of cracks, but being rebuilt day by day. While I fought my battles in the cabin, out in the world, my father and Hunter were growing restless. They came to check on me at the end of the 3rd week, as stipulated in the will. I heard their SUV from a distance, its engine roaring through the quiet forest. Hunter entered first, his familiar smirk plastered on his face. "Not bad, big brother," he said, glancing around the now tidier cabin. "But how much longer do you think you'll last? 10 more days and I bet you'll be crying to go home." My father stood at the door, silent, but his eyes were cold, scanning for any sign I was cheating. I didn't respond. I met Hunter's gaze, then turned back to my work, stoking the fire, patching a corner of the roof. But as they left, I overheard Hunter whispering to my father, "We need to do something. If he actually makes it, that fortune will never be ours." My heart raced. I knew they wouldn't sit idly by. That night, I checked everything in the cabin, from the water supply to the firewood pile, as if preparing for a siege. I didn't know what my father and Hunter would do, but I knew they wouldn't play fair. I sat by the fireplace, reopening the diary, rereading my grandfather's words. "The business world is a battlefield, but family shouldn't be the enemy." I wondered if he knew my father and Hunter would go to any lengths to stop me. Had he anticipated this when he designed this challenge? Day 25 arrived, bringing with it a colder than usual wind. The cabin was now far different from the day I first stepped inside. The roof no longer leaked, the windows were sealed, the fireplace burned steadily, and I had learned to use the forest to survive. I was no longer the trembling, starving Zayden of those early days. I was stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. Yet I knew the real challenge wasn't just the hunger or the cold. It was my family, those waiting for me to crumble. The 3rd diary had left me with mixed feelings. admiration tinged with sadness upon learning my grandfather wasn't perfect. He had built an empire, but at the cost of estranging my father, creating the family fractures I now faced. Today I stood by the fireplace holding a scrap of paper from the previous diary that read, "The fourth volume is in the drawer of the wooden desk in the small bedroom." I walked to the small room in the corner of the cabin, a place I rarely visited due to its dust and musty smell. The old wooden desk stood alone, its drawer stuck tight with rust. I pried it open with my folding knife, my heart racing as I spotted another familiar leather-bound notebook, wrapped in faded linen. I carried the notebook to the fireplace, sat down, and opened it. The first page read, "Diary, 1995, the days of being a father and grandfather." I turned the pages and my grandfather's voice came alive. Not as the young soldier or powerful businessman, but as a man confronting his own mistakes. He wrote about his years as a father to Theodore, my father. "I was too consumed with the company," he wrote, his handwriting shaky as if penned through tears. "I thought money and power would bring happiness to my family, but I was wrong. Theodore grew up in my coldness, and I didn't know how to pull my son back to me." I read, my heart tightening. I thought of my father, his harsh gaze, the way he always pushed me away. It turned out he wasn't just distant from me. He had been a son left in the shadow of ambition. My grandfather wrote on, describing the pain of realizing money had torn his family apart, the times he tried to talk to my father only to be met with silence or arguments. "I let money become a wall between me and my son," he wrote, "and that was the greatest mistake of my life." But then his tone brightened as he wrote about me. "Zayden is a light in my darkest days," he wrote. "That grandson listens to me not for money or power, but because he wants to understand. He has a heart I wish I'd had." I stopped reading, tears silently falling onto the pages. I remembered those afternoons by the Mississippi River when he shared stories of his life, his mistakes, his joys. I hadn't known those moments meant so much to him. I hadn't known I was his solace, the one he trusted to fix what he'd done wrong. I clutched the diary to my chest, crying like a child, not out of sadness, but from a strange closeness to my grandfather. He hadn't just left me a challenge. He'd left me his life, with its lessons, scars, and hopes. I looked around the cabin, seeing it as a metaphor for myself. Imperfect, full of cracks, but being rebuilt. I wiped my tears and whispered, "Thank you, Grandpa. I won't let you down." But just as I was lost in emotion, another storm arrived. That afternoon, I heard the familiar roar of an SUV in the distance. My father and Hunter had come to check on me a day earlier than scheduled. I stood trying to stay calm, but my heart pounded as I saw their expressions. Hunter walked in without a greeting, his eyes scanning the room like a vulture searching for prey. "Not bad, big brother," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But who do you think you're fooling? We know you've been getting supplies from outside." I froze, unable to believe my ears. "Supplies? I haven't contacted anyone," I shot back, my voice trembling with anger. My father stepped inside, his gaze icy. "Don't lie, Zayden," he said. "We found tire tracks from an unfamiliar vehicle near the stream a few days ago. Did you think you could fool the lawyer?" I shook my head, feeling the ground crumbling beneath me. "I haven't done anything wrong," I said through gritted teeth. "Are you that desperate to see me fail?" Hunter smirked, but my father just stared at me, his eyes devoid of emotion. "We'll report this to the lawyer," he said, then turned and left. That night I couldn't sleep. Anger and helplessness swirled inside me like a storm in my chest. I knew my father and Hunter were trying to frame me, to find a way to strip me of my inheritance, but I also knew they had no proof. I had followed every rule. No phone, no contact, no supplies. I had only this cabin, my grandfather's diaries, and the resolve he'd instilled in me. The next morning, the lawyer arrived carrying a tablet to review the surveillance camera footage. My father and Hunter stood on the porch, their faces brimming with confidence, as if they'd already won. But after examining the footage, the lawyer looked at them, his voice even. There's no evidence Zayden received any supplies. The cameras recorded all activity and he has complied fully with the rules. Hunter's face paled and my father clenched his fists but said nothing. They left in silence, but I knew this wasn't the end. The days that followed were marked by heightened vigilance. I checked everything in the cabin meticulously, from the water supply to the firewood stack to the wild raspberries I'd found in the forest. I didn't know what my father and Hunter would do next, but I sensed a storm brewing. Each night I sat by the fireplace, rereading my grandfather's diaries, letting his words fuel my strength. The fourth diary, with its confessions about family and the solace I brought him, had made me cry. But it also made me more determined than ever. Day 30 arrived, carrying a strange atmosphere. As dawn broke through the gaps in the trees, casting light on the cabin, now clean, warm, and far removed from the desolate ruin I'd entered a month ago. I stood in the main room, taking a deep breath, feeling as though I'd completed a long journey. I had turned this space into something I could call a home, but I knew the challenge wasn't over until I found the final diary. The fourth diary had instructed, "The fifth volume is in a wooden box under the bed in the small bedroom." I walked to the small room, knelt, and pulled out an old, dust-covered wooden box from beneath the bed. My hands trembled as I opened it, revealing the final leather-bound diary carefully wrapped in faded linen just like the others. As always, I sat by the fireplace to read. The first page read, "Diary 2020, a final message for Zayden." I turned the page and my grandfather's voice came alive, clear and close, as if he were sitting beside me. "Zayden, if you're reading this, you've overcome the challenge," he wrote. "I knew you could do it because you carry the Blackwood spirit, not the spirit of money or power, but of heart, perseverance, and honesty." I paused, tears falling before I realized. He had believed in me, even when I doubted myself. He continued, his tone calm yet powerful. "A true legacy isn't money, not the company or the things we leave behind. It's how you use what I've given you to create something meaningful. I made the mistake of letting money tear our family apart. Don't repeat that mistake, Zayden. Live true to your heart and make this world a little better, even if just by a fraction." His words were like a bittersweet blade, cutting deep into my soul. I sat still for a moment, then broke into sobs. Not out of sadness, but because I felt my grandfather was still here, guiding me, even though he was gone. I sat in the cabin, now warm and clean, a testament to what I'd achieved. I thought back to the first day when I shivered in the cold, battled hunger, and wrestled with fear. I remembered the sleepless nights, the moments I nearly gave up, and the times I found strength in my grandfather's words. This cabin wasn't just a place where I survived, it was where I rediscovered myself. That afternoon, the lawyer arrived, accompanied by my father and Hunter. I stood on the porch watching them step out of the sleek black SUV. Hunter's usual smirk was gone. His face was tense, his eyes glinting with unease. My father maintained his cold demeanor, but I noticed his hands clenching as if suppressing something. The lawyer checked the cameras, inspected the cabin, and finally looked at me, nodding. "Zayden Blackwood," he said, his voice steady and clear. "You have completed the challenge. The inheritance left to you by Mr. William Blackwood is now officially yours." I stood frozen, feeling as if the world had slowed. There was no applause, no congratulations, just a heavy silence from my father and Hunter. Hunter muttered something under his breath, but I didn't care. My father looked at me, his gaze no longer icy but tinged with something. Perhaps surprise, perhaps defeat. They got back in the SUV and left without another word. I stood there under a sky clearing after days of rain, feeling as though I'd stepped through a new door. I returned inside, sat by the fireplace, and reopened the final diary. I read my grandfather's message again, and this time I smiled. "I'll do it, Grandpa," I whispered. I'll use this inheritance to create something meaningful as you wanted. The cabin was no longer just a challenge. It was proof of my resilience, of my grandfather's love, and of the path I would continue to walk. The fire in the hearth burned steadily, warm and unwavering like the fire in my heart. I stood looking around the now familiar cabin and knew this was only the beginning. 7 years have passed, and I stood on the balcony of my office in downtown New Orleans, gazing at the Mississippi River shimmering under the sunset. My company, Blackwood Education, is now a familiar name in the education sector. I used my grandfather's inheritance, the company shares and cash, as startup capital. But instead of diving into the cutthroat world of mining or timber like my father and Hunter, I chose my own path. I founded a chain of nonprofit education centers where children from impoverished neighborhoods can study history, literature, and life skills without worrying about tuition. I wanted to create a legacy, not through money or power, but through the values my grandfather taught me: knowledge, perseverance, and kindness. The early days weren't easy. I had to learn how to manage, negotiate, and face small failures. There were nights I stayed up, consumed by worries about finances and whether I had the strength to take the company further. But each time doubt crept in, I recalled my grandfather's words from his diaries. Failure isn't the end. It's just a lesson if you dare to stand up and learn. I stood up again and again, and gradually Blackwood Education became a beacon, bringing knowledge to those who needed it most. I'm no longer the Zayden of 7 years ago, the timid young man scorned by his family, trembling in a cold, dilapidated cabin. I've grown, matured, and I dare say I've become a man of strength and respect. Not because I have money or power, but because I live true to my heart, true to what my grandfather wanted. I still teach, occasionally standing before a classroom, sharing stories of history and watching the kids' eyes sparkle as they discover the world. Those moments remind me why I started, why I never gave up. Meanwhile, the picture for my father and Hunter was the complete opposite. The vast fortune they inherited from my grandfather, the lion's share of the company, the valuable properties, wasn't used as a foundation to build upon. Instead, they squandered it, as if money were infinite. My father invested in risky ventures, flashy real estate projects without proper planning. Hunter lived like a spoiled prince, throwing money at cars, parties, and lavish trips. I heard from my mother during her rare phone calls that Hunter frequently appeared in tabloids with headlines about his reckless lifestyle. My father, meanwhile, grew increasingly harsh, locking himself in his office, trying to salvage mounting debts. I wasn't surprised when I heard the Blackwood conglomerate, my grandfather's pride, was faltering. My father's poor decisions, Hunter's irresponsibility, and fierce market competition pushed the company to the brink of bankruptcy. One day, my mother called, her voice trembling. "Theodore and Hunter, they've lost everything, Zayden. The house in the Garden District was foreclosed, and the company is gone." I sat in silence, unsure how to feel. Part of me ached, knowing it was my grandfather's legacy, his life's blood. But another part deep down felt they deserved it. They had everything, but they chose to squander it instead of building. I met my father and Hunter one last time at a small cafe in the French Quarter. They appeared no longer polished as before. My father looked aged, his hair white, his eyes weary, his shoulders slightly hunched as if carrying the weight of years of mistakes. Hunter's arrogant smirk was gone, replaced by a bitter expression, as if the world had turned its back on him. I sat across from them, a steaming coffee in front of me, and for the first time, I didn't feel like the scorned son or the mocked brother. I was Zayden Blackwood, the man who had overcome my grandfather's challenge and built something to be proud of. I looked at my father, then at Hunter, and decided to share something I'd kept to myself for years. "Dad, Hunter," I began, my voice steady but clear, "I want to tell you about the diaries Grandpa left me." They looked up, their eyes a mix of curiosity and skepticism. I told them about the cabin, the 30 days I survived there, and the 5 diaries, each a piece of my grandfather's life. I spoke about the 4th diary, the painful lines where he admitted his mistakes. Grandpa wrote that he regretted missing your childhood, Dad, I said, looking directly into my father's eyes. He said he was too busy with the company, with money, and left you to grow up in his coldness. He wanted to make it right, but he didn't know how. My father stayed silent, his gaze softening, as if my words had stirred a buried memory. He also wrote that I was his light, I continued, my voice catching. He saw in me a chance to do things differently, to heal what he'd done wrong. And I think he wanted that for our whole family. Hunter lowered his head, his hands gripping his coffee cup, silent. But I saw his eyes redden, as if my words had touched something deep within him. My father took a long breath, then spoke, his voice hoarse. Zayden, I was wrong. I followed my father's path, but I was worse. I pushed you away just as he did to me. He paused, looking at me, and for the first time I saw tears in his eyes. You've done what I never could. I'm sorry. That apology, though late, felt like a warm breeze through my chest. It might not erase the years of distance, but it was a start. Hunter remained quiet, but when I looked at him, I saw a faint spark in his eyes. Not arrogance or bitterness, but a hint of hope. Big brother, he said, his voice soft but sincere. Maybe I need to learn how to stand up like you did. I smiled, nodding. I wasn't sure if Hunter could live up to his words, but in him I saw a sign of growth, a chance to start anew. I stepped out of the cafe, the gentle New Orleans sunlight caressing my face, a reminder that I had walked the right path. My father's belated apology and the spark of hope in Hunter's eyes lingered in my mind. I didn't know if they would change, if they could find themselves as I had in the cabin, but I hoped. Not because I wanted them to be like me, but because I wanted them to understand what my grandfather taught me. True value lies not in money, but in how we live and what we leave behind. I turned my grandfather's inheritance into something meaningful. Not just for me, but for the hundreds of children learning in my centers, children who have the chance to change their lives through knowledge. Every time I step into a classroom, seeing the bright eyes of kids as they debate history or share their dreams, I see my grandfather in them, his stern but trusting gaze, his warm voice reminding me that life isn't about what we have, but what we leave behind. 7 years have passed since I walked out of that cabin, but that journey still lives in me, a flame that never fades. Today I returned to the cabin for the first time in years. The mountain road was still rugged, strewn with gravel and pine needles, but it no longer carried the somber air it once did. Sunlight filtered through the trees, illuminating the path as if nature itself were welcoming me. The cabin appeared before me, still small, still humble, but no longer desolate. I had hired people to restore it, turning it into a memorial. A small museum dedicated to my grandfather, preserving his memories, my journey, and the lessons he passed down. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my feet, but the sound was no longer menacing. The main room was clean, sunlight streaming through new windows, and the fireplace stood like an old friend. On the walls I had hung photographs, my grandfather as a young man in his Vietnam War uniform, my grandfather in his office, a rare smile on his face as he signed a major deal, and a photo of him and me by the Mississippi River, his eyes alight as he shared stories of his life. In a corner I placed a small table displaying the 5 diaries carefully preserved in glass cases. Each one was a piece of my grandfather, a part of the legacy he left me. I stood by the fireplace where I once huddled against the biting cold, where I wept reading his words. I touched the wall, feeling the rough wood, and whispered, "You're still here, teaching me, even though you're gone." Tears fell silently, but not from sadness. I cried out of gratitude, feeling that my grandfather had never truly left. He was in every line of his diaries, every lesson, and in the person I am today. I stepped outside onto the porch, gazing at the sprawling forest before me. The wind blew, carrying the scent of pine and earth, reminding me of the days I struggled to survive. I thought of my grandfather's message: material wealth can vanish, as it did for my father and Hunter. But spiritual values, the moral legacy, perseverance, sincerity, and the desire to do good are what endure. I had seen that in my own life. My grandfather's inheritance wasn't just money. It was an opportunity to create change, to bring light to those who needed it. I thought of the next generation, the children in my centers who might carry this path forward. I've started writing a book, not to boast of my success, but to tell the story of my grandfather, the cabin, and the lessons I learned in those 30 days. I want to pass down his legacy, not through wealth, but through the values he lived and died for. I want future generations to know that no matter how harsh life gets, they can always rise as my grandfather did, as I did. I left the cabin as the sun set, its fiery red glow bathing the forest. I don't know what the future holds, but I know I'll keep living true to my grandfather's teachings. His legacy isn't in buildings or bank accounts. It's in me, in the children I teach, and in those who will continue this path. I smiled, got into my truck, feeling as though my grandfather were standing somewhere, patting my shoulder, as he had so many times before.